This is a video about the Methods of Vedantic Knowledge, the 8th chapter of the first book of Sri Aurobindo's Life Divine. Good morning, this is Chris speaking with a new video on the Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo's main work or one of his main works. This time the 8th chapter of the first book of the Life Divine, the Methods of Vedantic Knowledge, which is one of my favorite chapters. Thank you for liking and subscribing. This chapter is the last of the introductory chapters of the Life Divine. The Vedas and the Upanishads are the true foundation of Sri Aurobindo's teachings, but he goes even further and updates them to modern times and completes them. It's also very interesting and maybe even important to know that Sri Aurobindo at first published the Life Divine chapter by chapter in his magazine Arya, just as now I present to you the summaries chapter by chapter. So it was very suspenseful. What would be next? Maybe today he would be a YouTuber, I sometimes think, but back then publishing a magazine was the way to go. Later he revised the book when it was put together into one volume or two. Also during the time he wrote The Synthesis of Yoga, The Secrets of the Vedas, and he started with Savitri. So to get the complete picture one would have to read all of them parallelly. I will start summarizing the synthesis after I finished with the Life Divine, which I think is the basis of it all. We have seen in the previous chapters that mankind has a destiny, that of spiritual progress and evolution of consciousness, which is a part of a much greater development and process than is possible for us to grasp. And yet we are part of it and not an unimportant one. And we have seen that ignorance and ego are also part of the whole. The whole can only be a true unity and oneness if it includes everything. Absolutely everything, including ego and duality and so on. Unfortunately, the ego is in itself a limiting factor. It is a kind of concentration of a tiny aspect and moreover a delusion that this is all there is or that this is all there is to know, which is plainly not true. It is both correct and at the same time false, that what we can perceive and think and imagine is all there is, or is a mere illusion. These are just the two possible viewpoints of many, viewpoints, but the most prominent. And if we want to glimpse a higher, more complete truth, we have to find new ways of thinking, feeling, experiencing, and so on, to get out of our old habits. For that is all they are, habits. Sri Aurobindo makes it very clear. All that we have been doing so far are habits because we have repeating them over and over, but it's possible to get out of it. Both in our personal life and our collective life of mankind, we have trained ourselves to be very good at a few things, but then disregarded all the others. Now, and it is even worse because we leave much of our research to machines and computers now and trust our mechanical brain children fully, thinking that their computation must be objective. But of course, computers are only advanced pocket calculators, that's why they're called computers, and they're only as good and as intelligent as their creators, albeit much faster. And we are their creators, so if our thinking is flawed, they are flawed as well. Now, to arrive at a divine knowledge and divine life, we need to open up a totally new set of abilities. At first, this consists of enlarging our present faculties of the senses, of the sense mind, the manas, which can be called the sixth sense. But it is actually only one sense, and all the 5 main senses and a few others are just feeding the manas. The manas is the one main sense, and all the senses are just aspects of it, organs of it. Same goes for our ratio, our reason, our ability to think clearly. And like the German and British philosophers of the 18th and 19th century, like Hume, Immanuel Kant, Hegel, Fichte, and so on, also have discovered, there is in us, and thus accessible to us, a pure reason, a method of thinking which is much purer, sharper, and more reliable and direct than our usual confused thinking. This pure reason is to the thinking mind what the manas is to our senses. It is its root and actual functioning, undiluted and unfocused. In Sanskrit there are many words for mind, but just as there are many words for love or consciousness, pure reason is called buddhi in Sanskrit, and there are other words for different kinds of thinking. But even these are not enough to see a higher truth. Manas and buddhi, they're just improvements on our seemingly inherent limitations. For we tend to assume that we are eternally bound to these limitations and give up on the possibility of a higher consciousness as a fairy tale. Many of us do. The link to our higher faculties mentioned in the Vedas and later in the Upanishads is our old cogito ergo sum, which Descartes and Chet McKenna so love. Of course, they didn't call it cogito ergo sum, that was Descartes' Latin wording, but it's the same thing. I think, therefore I am. Or Chet's version, I feel, therefore I am. This is all we can be sure about. This is the only fact in our lives. Anything else could be imagination. But the sensation of emness or of being is the only objective sensation. And this is the door to the higher power of intuition. The I am is not the end, but the beginning. We also know it as the I am that, the Soham in Indian tradition. Through our power of self-awareness, other forms of experience open up to us, if we let them, and if we don't immediately censor them by our habitual primitive form of thought. The two realms of experience that will open up to us then are the subconscious all and the superconscious all, as Sri Aurobindo calls them. The subconscious will connect us directly with the secrets of nature, of life itself, which works in direct action and manifestation. And the superconscious will connect us to what is called light in spirituality, for lack of a better term. Of course, it's not light. It is not a light as opposed to darkness or opposed to anything. It is an objective absolute that we experience as something awe-inspiring. Awesome, as we would say today. And one of the few words that are fitting to describe it is light. This light does not contain individual knowledge, but it is the law and principle underlying or overlaying every form of experience and awareness. It exists in us as intuition. It is not so much a faculty like sight, not a faculty that is trying to grasp something like reason or other senses, but it is a direct connection from above down to us, no longer masked or diluted. Any other of our faculties can only be intermediaries to its purity, as Sri Aurobindo puts it. And the Vedas arrive through intuitive knowledge at the Sat Brahman, pure existence, indefinable, infinite, absolute, ever-changing and yet ever-changeless, as the fundamental reality of all. This seems to be the highest truth we can arrive at. And this Sat Brahman is all there is, and we can experience it as something called Sat Chit Ananda. When we normally perceive the world, it is matter in motion. When we perceive the world with intuition, we see the absolute, which seems to be motionless and yet beyond the absence of anything. So it's not without motion, but it's in itself beyond motion and no motion. It's motionless because it's the source of everything. But once matter manifests together with motion and time. And once we glimpse the true truth, so to say, it is more important to hold on to it. The door to the higher realms is open for a moment and then it swings shut again. That's also a very nice description of Sri Aurobindo. Yeah? If you use your intuition, a door swings open. It's not you who open the door, but the door swings open if you're in the right mindset, so to say, intuition set. But it swings shut again once you leave that mindset. And we have to train ourselves to admit it more and more so that the door can stay open more and more often and longer stretches of time. And then we admit the play of intuition instead of the sense mind. That is the trick. Intuition is our first teacher in both meanings of the word. It is the first real teacher and it is also the best teacher. It is the master in us. Everyone has a master in him or herself, the guru internally. We don't really need an external guru because we are as connected to that, to the whole, as anyone else, in principle. But it is also always veiled by the mind. And the starting point of letting intuition inform and guide us are the Upanishadic declarations like I am he and thou art that and all is the Brahman. This is the divine light streaming into us from what feels like above, a beam of clear light through the thick canopy of trees. Of course, it doesn't come from above because there's no up and down and left and right and so on, but it feels like it's coming from above. At this point, I want to talk about a topic which I have skipped in a previous chapter because it fits better here, where it is also mentioned. The modern term is spiritual bypass or spiritual materialism. I think it's very cool that Sri Aurobindo mentions that. He has observed it back then already and it's still very popular today. He writes that each step is necessary. Of course, no path is the same, and each seeker might experience each stage differently. Very likely so. But each stage must be passed nonetheless. A bit like spiral dynamics, really. First, the development of ego, mind and senses, which is first tier. Then the discovery of pure reason and manas, which catapults you into second tier, and then you're in yellow. And from there on, you do not develop your ego anymore, your personality, but your soul and your intuition. Until you arrive at teal, or violet, as they are called, the same stage. And then you have intuition as your permanent companion to guide you, where the ego does not play a prominent role anymore. It's still there, but it's not important anymore. You're not bound to listen to it anymore. And this is so similar to spiral dynamics that it is no wonder that Ken Wilber was fascinated by it, and maybe Claire Graves as well. Maybe he read Sri Aurobindo, I'm not sure. Watch my spiral dynamics videos if you're interested in that. It's a very, very helpful description of the stages one usually goes through. And I digress a little bit, but the point here is that Sri Aurobindo mentions that you cannot jump from a lower mind and lower senses to the intuition and direct knowledge right away. And many people try that. But there is no shortcut. You can go through the stages faster than average, but you cannot skip them. One stage might take someone a few months and the other person 10 years. Who knows? But you have to go through them in one way, in one form or another. And people who try to skip it, they imagine that they are where they are really not. Some get frustrated and give up. Some really go through the stages, and some just think, okay, now I'm there because I heard of them. Because I bask in the light of my teacher, I'm also there. And then you have religious followers who cannot walk their talk, they just quote. And Sri Aurobindo initially for his ashram, he planned to gather dozens of powerful yogis around himself. For his aim was to free India, but more than that, change the whole world. He was like Meher Baba, an avatar kind of person. He saw it as his role to make things easier for the whole world, where the progress of the consciousness of humanity was concerned. To speed up evolution a little bit. But as far as I know, he did not find as many accomplished yogis as he wanted to. He did find some, and he did start the ashram in Pondicherry, which was a French colony back then, so it was safe from British persecution. For he was, next to Gandhi back then, probably the most prominent and influential and important figures in India's struggle for freedom from colonialism. And he was even much more radical than Gandhi. But for all the Indian viewers here, you already know this. And I might do a separate video about Sri Aurobindo and politics for my non-Indian listeners. You can see here though that Sri Aurobindo went through all kinds of stages, including spiral dynamics green revolution. Now the trouble is that he moved so far and so fast up all the stages to teal and beyond that even back then he was way ahead of his time. And now 100 years later he still is ahead of his time. And while his language is a little bit verbose, his instructions and descriptions are quite exact if you get used to his language, his writing style. You just have to get to know him well enough to extract this knowledge from his complicated spiral sentences. Recently, one of you asked me where to start with Sri Aurobindo. I said, why not start with the Life Divine, because I'm summarizing it anyway right now. But my personal favorite is Savitri. Yet he wrote all of these books at the same time, parallelly over a span of some 7 years, and improved on them later, especially Savitri. I do not have enough time right now, but it would actually be best to read the Life Divine and the Synthesis of Yoga parallelly, because the basis of his teaching is founded on the Vedas and Upanishads, and he has updated them and freed them from coded secret language. And it's all there in these 2 books. But right now I'm focusing on the Life Divine. The Vedic and Upanishadic sages relied 100% on intuition and spiritual experience to get this direct knowledge. But they also use pure reason, Sri Aurobindo writes, to cross-check all the direct knowledge, the Shruti they received. And this method Sri Aurobindo has also applied in his own studies and own writings. First, receive it directly from the highest source possible, and then cross-check it and put it into words as much as it is possible. That is why he sounds like a philosopher, like a man of theory, but he was not. He was very practical. It is his language that mutilates direct knowledge a little bit, as language does for everyone. And he was a poet by heart, so he used very poetic language, and this actually also helps. It's very beautiful, his writing style. But he did not skip a step on the way. Before he was able to receive Shruti, he passed all previous stages by his difficult childhood, for example, and then his political career. Only when he was threatened the second time with jail, he fled to French India, to Pondicherry, and started to work on politics from a more subtle and mental direction. But he never stopped. He was always involved in one way or another, and India was liberated in 1947 and Sri Aurobindo died in 1950, which he had both foreseen. And his birthday now is the Indian Independence Day, the 15th of August. But his aim was not only the independence of India, but also the ascent of humanity and the independence of the human race from ego domination. The ego is what we get to start with, like a survival specialist, like a Bear Grylls or Ed Stafford. Yeah, the survival specialist gets only a knife and then gets sent off into the wilderness. But from this primitive starting point, a human being can build upon. He can build a shelter and make fire and can hunt and boil water and build a fishing rod and a canoe and so on. Yeah. What we usually do is we keep the knife and then complain that it is so difficult to survive. No one ever said you have to only use the knife. That's what you get to start with, but then you can build other tools and use your intelligence to improve upon your situation. Of course, it is difficult if you're ill-equipped, but move on, expand, and most of all, find your pure reason first and your manas, and then your intuition. Don't jump from confused thought to intuition, because you will not be able to tell them apart anyway. But if you go to your for your pure reason and your manas first, then later you can develop the intuition, and then the intuition becomes clearer and clearer. And once you're linked by intuition to the divine, you can pull down direct knowledge, receive direct knowledge, and understand all previous knowledge. But you cannot jump there. That would be megalomania based on our minority complex. Unfortunately, as I've explained from earlier chapters, you have to worm your way upwards through suffering. That is the present setup, still. But Sri Aurobindo describes a solution, and this solution is similar to that of the Vedas. And even if you arrive at enlightenment at last, you still have to use pure reason and worldly involvement to ground yourself. Not just fly away into the clouds with your mind and forget that you are still just a human being with a body, although with a link to the divine. And Sri Aurobindo used politics to ground himself. That is a very important fact that should not be forgotten. Now, okay, that we have dealt with all the basics of Sri Aurobindo's Life Divine with the first 8 chapters, the book starts to go much deeper, or higher if you like. The next chapter is called The Pure Existent. Thank you to all my Patreons. Thank you for liking, subscribing, and sharing the videos with your friends. And see you soon.